When a furious stranger storms into a quiet Texas cafe and confronts Clint Eastwood, no one expects what happens next. But by the time the man leaves, the entire cafe and his life will never be the same. If you love powerful stories where a single conversation can change a life, make sure to hit subscribe because this one might just surprise you. The sun was starting to dip low over a small-town cafe in the heart of Texas. Inside, the air was thick with the familiar scents of freshly brewed coffee and aged wood, blending into a comforting warmth. The quiet hum of conversation floated through the space, blending with the soft clinking of spoons against porcelain cups. In a corner near the window, half hidden in the fading light, sat Clint Eastwood. His presence didn't demand attention, but it held it quietly. Dressed in a long wool coat, a sturdy button-down shirt, well-worn jeans, and rugged leather boots, he exuded a quiet confidence that few could match. Faded jeans, a little loose, and boots that had walked more miles than anyone could count. On the table sat a plain cup of black coffee, its steam curling in the air like the last trace of a fading campfire. Next to it, a thick book, the kind where the pages were bent and worn, the kind that had traveled with him from one dusty town to the next. This was where Clint found his peace, not in the noise of Hollywood or under the spotlight, but in quiet corners like this. Places where no one cared about his fame, only about the weather, the coffee, and whatever story his worn boots might have carried in. But that peace, like all things, was about to be broken. The bell above the cafe door gave a soft chime, but no one really looked up. Customers were too wrapped up in their own conversations, their coffee cups, their quiet afternoon. No one noticed the man who stepped inside, at least not at first. He looked to be in his mid-40s, the kind of man life had taken a swing at more than once. His face was carved by hard years, deep lines at the corners of his mouth, the shadow of permanent exhaustion under his eyes. His boots were scuffed, his shirt creased, and though his clothes weren't torn, they carried the weight of someone who knew how to stretch $1. He paused just past the door, scanning the room with sharp, restless eyes, like a man looking for a fight before anyone even gave him a reason. And then, his gaze landed on Clint Eastwood. The shift was almost physical, like the room itself could sense the tension crackling between them. The man's jaw tightened. His fists curled at his sides, knuckles whitening. His boots thudded against the wooden floor as he strode across the room straight toward Clint's table. The gentle hum of conversation faded, replaced by silence. Every head turned, eyes darting between Clint and the stranger. Then came the voice, sharp, raw, and loud enough to shatter the quiet. "You think you're better than everyone else? You think you're special?" The words hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. For a moment, no one breathed. All eyes were on Clint. Conversations died out. Every eye shifted toward the corner table, where the stranger stood, fists clenched, voice still ringing in the air. Behind the counter, the barista's hand hovered, coffee pot tilting dangerously close to overflowing. A few regulars exchanged uneasy glances, but no one moved. No one wanted to be the first to step into whatever was about to unfold. Clint didn't react right away. Instead, with the same slow composure he'd carried his whole life, he closed his book. The sound of the cover meeting the table was quiet, but in that silence, it might as well have been a gun cocking. Finally, Clint lifted his gaze, those legendary steel blue eyes locking onto the man like twin barrels of a rifle, calm, measuring, unshaken. The stranger's breathing was shallow, his chest rising and falling with the weight of anger he couldn't contain. "People like you." His voice cracked, somewhere between fury and despair. "You get everything handed to you. You ever lose it all? You ever had to start over with nothing?" The bitterness in his voice wasn't just aimed at Clint. It was aimed at every injustice life had ever thrown his way. Clint wasn't just Clint in that moment. He was a symbol, the face of every man the stranger thought had it easy. But Clint didn't flinch. His silence wasn't arrogance. It was something far heavier, something that said, "I've seen this before." Most people would have snapped back, defended themselves, or thrown an insult right back. But Clint Eastwood wasn't most people. He leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxed, but there was no mistaking the quiet strength in his presence. His hand rested lightly on the side of his coffee cup, the steam curling into the air between them. "Sit down," Clint said, his voice low, steady, calm, yet commanding. The man's brow furrowed, caught off guard. He had stormed over expecting resistance, maybe even a fight. Instead, Clint's response knocked him off balance. "Sit? Why the hell would I do that?" The man spat, his voice still sharp, but now laced with confusion. Clint lifted his coffee, took a slow sip, his eyes never leaving the man's face. "Because everyone's got a story," Clint said quietly. "And I want to hear yours." That simple sentence hung in the air, cutting through the tension like a knife. For a moment the man said nothing. Around them, the cafe stood still. Every customer, every staff member frozen in place, ears straining to catch what would happen next. Even the faint hum of the coffee machine seemed to fade into silence. No anger, no arguments, just a man willing to listen. It was not the response anyone had expected, but somehow it was exactly the one that changed everything. The man stood frozen for a moment, like he wasn't sure whether to speak or walk away. Then, with a bitter sigh, he pulled out the chair and slumped into it across from Clint. "I used to have a job, a real one. Factory work, steady pay, decent life." His fingers tapped absently on the table, his gaze fixed somewhere far away. Then one day, the factory shut down. Hundreds of us out on the street, promised help that never came. He shook his head, his voice lower now, like the fight was draining out of him. "I tried to keep it together, took any job I could find, but when you're barely scraping by, it doesn't take much to lose everything. My wife, she left, took the kids, said she couldn't live like this anymore." The cafe was so quiet, you could hear the hum of the coffee machine. The man glanced around the room, eyes sharp with embarrassment. "Now, every time I walk into a place like this, people don't see me. They see a loser." For the first time, his anger cracked, revealing something far more painful underneath: shame. Clint didn't speak. He didn't argue or try to fix it. He just listened. And somehow that silence meant more than any speech could. Clint didn't rush to respond. He let the man's pain settle in the air, respecting its weight. Then, with the same calm that had carried him through countless storms, both on screen and in life, Clint spoke. "I've never stood exactly where you're standing," Clint admitted, his voice low and even. "But I know what it feels like to be judged the second you walk through a door." The man's brow furrowed, confusion flickering across his face. "You think sitting here, drinking coffee, means I've had it easy?" Clint leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady. "People see me, and they don't see a man. They see a myth, a legend they built in their own heads, but they don't know the real story." He paused, fingers tracing the edge of his coffee cup. "They don't know about the odd jobs I worked, digging ditches, hauling lumber. They don't know I spent nights sleeping in the back of a beat-up truck because I couldn't afford a room. I wasn't born into Hollywood. I fought for every damn step." The man's eyes widened, his anger faltering. It was clear he hadn't expected this. "I'm not saying my struggles are the same as yours," Clint added, "but pain is pain, and nobody gets to decide whose is more real." For the first time, the man didn't have a comeback. He just sat there, quietly absorbing the truth that sometimes even legends have dirt under their nails. For a moment, no one in the cafe dared to move. Every breath seemed held in suspense, waiting to see how this confrontation, this collision of two lives, would end. The man sat frozen, his fingers tapping nervously against the tabletop. Then, slowly, almost reluctantly, he extended his hand toward Clint. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice quieter than before. "I judged you before I even knew who you really were." Clint didn't rush to take the hand. He let the apology sit between them for a second, not as a punishment, but as a way to make sure the words truly meant something, Then Clint reached out, his grip firm and steady, the way only a man who's lived through storms knows how to shake a hand. "We all carry burdens," Clint said, his voice low but filled with quiet conviction. "But no one should have to carry them alone." It wasn't just a handshake. It was an unspoken agreement, a recognition that beneath all the anger, all the assumptions, they were just two men trying to find their way. Around them, the cafe seemed to exhale all at once. The tension that had hung so heavy in the air melted into something softer, something almost hopeful. A few customers clapped gently, not out of obligation but because they had witnessed something real. The man walked out of the cafe, but something about him was different. His steps were slower, more thoughtful, but his shoulders, once slumped under the weight of anger and bitterness, now sat a little higher, a little lighter. Clint didn't say another word. He simply turned back to his coffee and his book. But the cafe around him, it wasn't the same place anymore. Conversations returned, but this time, they felt warmer. There was laughter where there had been silence. Strangers who had ignored each other now exchanged small smiles. Even the barista, who had spent the afternoon bracing for the worst, seemed to move with a little more ease. One honest conversation, one quiet act of listening, and the entire atmosphere of that little cafe had changed. "Sometimes, all we need is someone willing to listen," Clint murmured quietly, almost to himself. But somehow it felt like the whole room heard him. And maybe, just maybe, the man who left that cafe would remember this moment, not as the day he confronted Clint Eastwood, but as the day someone finally heard him. If you believe that even the smallest act of kindness can create a ripple that changes everything, then don't just watch this story, be part of it.